also known as the Swan City, is located just 464 kilometers northwest of Edmonton, along the Alaska Highway route. But you don't have to drive. The Grand Prairie Airport makes it easy for anyone to fly in on a number of major and smaller commercial airlines.
Hello everyone, I'm here with Ann Collins, VP Publisher, Random House Canada, who just shares news this morning at our publishing meeting about a new book acquired yesterday. Ann, I'm sure that book readers everywhere would love to hear about this book and why you're so excited about us publishing it.
I am really excited, and it was one of those moments you get a proposal in and every single little hair on your arm rises because you're so excited by it. And Canadian narrative nonfiction is one of my all-time favorites, and you look and look for the best one you could ever find because you really know readers will get into it. And this one is phenomenal. It is called Into the Abyss, and it recreates what happened in a plane crash about 25 years ago. It was a plane crash in the north, the far north of Canada, in which a new pilot had to fly into a snowstorm. He had 9 passengers on board. The plane went down. 6 of those passengers died, and 4 survived, including the pilot. And what makes the thing so phenomenal is the nature of the people who survived. There was a RCMP officer, the criminal he was taking to face prosecution, a politician, the first Canadian Muslim cabinet minister, and the pilot himself, who felt incredibly guilty. 3 of them were wounded. The only one who was unwounded was the criminal, and none of them would have survived if the cop hadn't undone the handcuffs holding the criminal, that he had on the criminal before the plane went down. So the criminal could have run away through the trees. Instead, because he wasn't really a bad guy, he was just a hard luck guy, he was the one who helped the 3 severely injured other people survive the night, survive until they were found. And the other thing that's so remarkable about it is it's kind of a hero's journey, because all 4 of these men were completely transfigured by the crash. The cop quit the RCMP, for instance, ended up hiking the the BC coast wilderness with the pilot who almost killed him. The cabinet minister, who had sort of downplayed his religious heritage and his ethnic heritage in order to be successful in politics, came into his own as a leader of the Muslim community. The criminal who was facing court ended up being let off all his charges and proclaimed a hero. And what's so remarkable about the book too is the angle that the writer has on it. She's a woman named Carol Shaben, and her father was the politician in the crash. So all of her adult life, she has been slowly putting together the pieces of this story because she saw the way it transfigured her dad, and she wanted to understand the way it transfigured the others.
Wow, Ann, that sounds absolutely fantastic. How long do we have to wait?
Well, I'll have a manuscript in a year, so everybody will have to wait 2 years, but it's going to be worth the wait.
Great.
famous author, Carol Shaben, author of Into the Abyss. What inspired you to write this book and share your story?
Well, what inspired me was this crazy constellation of events that happened, which is these 4 very different men ended up on the same small plane. There was a prominent politician who was my dad, which is how I knew about the story. There was a young pilot, a rookie, who didn't want to fly because the weather was terrible that night, but he felt like he didn't have a choice. His job was on the line. And there was a young RCMP officer and the accused criminal he was escorting in handcuffs to face charges. And the crazy thing that happened was, against regulations, this cop decided to unshackle his prisoner. And the prisoner was the only one to escape uninjured and ended up saving everybody's lives. And that just seemed so unbelievable to me. It seemed like if it was fiction, people wouldn't believe it, but it actually happened. So that was, I just thought that was an amazing story that had to be told. And it wasn't just that these men, that this accused criminal rescued everyone, but then a friendship began between all these men that lasted their lifetime. That was really cool too. Their lives were all changed profoundly by what happened. And I think it was because they all thought they weren't going to survive the night, and they almost didn't survive the night. So each of them had a chance to really think about, what's the meaning of life? What's a life worth? Am I living the life the way I want to live it? If I get off of this mountain, will I do things differently? And for all of them, it was the beginning of a journey to try and make something different of their life. Well, for the pilot, it was a bit different. He just wanted to redeem himself because 6 people died, and it was his fault because he made an error. So he had a really tough time. He was 24, and so he spent his life trying to atone for what he had done and to make things right. For my dad, the politician, he began to think about, well, do I want this life in politics? Is there more I can do? And he knew a lot of the people on the plane. So for him, it was like, why am I alive? And all these, he lost a colleague, he lost people from the community that he knew. Why me? Why have I been chosen to carry on? Maybe there's something more I should be doing. For the criminal who'd had this terrible life, he dropped out of school, no one really believed in him, he became a hero. And he thought, this is my chance to turn my life around, to really make something of my life. And for the RCMP, who just kind of gone from high school into being a corrections officer to the RCMP, when he was laying there dying on the mountain waiting for rescue, he thought to himself, I haven't done any of the things I wanted to do with my life. And he made a bucket list, a list of goals, and he began to tick them off. So for all of these guys, it was a huge life-changing event.
Thank you for that great summary of Into the Abyss and helping us understand the characters.
You're welcome, Max.
As the topic of this interview is speculative history, so I'm going to ask you about the pivotal moment, which was obviously when the RCMP took Paul's handcuffs off. What do you think would have happened if he didn't take his handcuffs off?
That's a really interesting question, Max. I honestly think that if those handcuffs hadn't been taken off, none of those men would have survived. Certainly, the RCMP has told me, he said, I wouldn't have survived because it was the young criminal who pulled him out. The RCMP was buried underneath the fuselage. He was suffocating, and my dad, your grandfather, tried to pull him out, and he couldn't. And the pilot, his hands had been all smashed because when they crashed, he put his hands up like this in front of the windshield, and so they were completely mangled. He had no ability to grip, and there were pieces of the plane on this guy. So without this young, strong drifter, the RCMP officer is certain he would not have gotten out of there. He would have been buried alive. And then, because this Paul Archambault, this criminal, had grown up on the streets, he was a drifter. He had taken some, he'd been out in the wilderness. He had been homeless. He just kept his wits about him. First of all, he didn't get cold, and secondly, he wasn't injured, so that was just a twist of fate. But he just, because he was such a survivor, because he'd had such a tough life, it just didn't occur to him to give up. He just did what he knew how to do. He went and kept the fire going. He just went back and forth doggedly through this, forest, through the snow, and he just kept pulling back lumber, throwing it on the fire, telling jokes to keep the other men's spirits up. So he was a really pivotal guy. And had he been handcuffed, had history been different, he would have been useless that night. He wouldn't have. And the other thing that happened was really interesting, because he had no handcuffs on and he was quick on his feet. When he felt the plane starting to crash, he quickly unbuckled and he floated above all the luggage and debris, and he feels like that's why he was not severely injured, because he was so quick thinking, and he wouldn't have been able to do that if he was handcuffed.
Did Scott have any previous experience with criminals on airplanes, and had there been any history with that, or was that his first time?
I think it was probably his first time, but what's really interesting is, if you're talking about speculative history, here's a whole other series of events, because Scott and his prisoner were booked on a flight out that morning. Scott had come into Kamloops and to pick him up, and they were supposed to be on their way right out. They had a series of flights, and if that was the case, he would have kept him handcuffed, I'm sure. But what happened? The paperwork to release him from the detention center, to release Paul the prisoner, wasn't done. So they missed their flight. So here's again history kind of taking a turn. So they missed their flight. So now, instead of going straight to where they needed to go, they had to fly on standby. They had to wait in airports and wait for flights, and it was miserable weather, and the flights were backlogged. And so in spending time with this guy, who would have just been this unknown prisoner, he got to know him as a person. And so what that meant is, by the time they got onto the flight, how many hours later, because they went from Kamloops to Calgary, from Calgary to Edmonton, and then this was their third flight. He just knew by then, oh, this guy's not a threat. I've spent the whole day with him. We've talked. So, yeah. So if that paperwork had been done and they had left the detention center as they were supposed to have left, he wouldn't have got a chance to know him, and I don't think he ever would have taken the handcuffs off, because the cop was a by-the-book kind of guy. But in this circumstance, because of the way things unfolded, he didn't feel he was a threat, so he took off the handcuffs.
What do you think about Eric's assumption that Paul would find the gun and kill him because he crashed the plane?
Well, that's a good question too. Max, you're so smart. Let's take after your father. I think that was really interesting, because sometimes we have first impressions of people. And Eric, the pilot's first impression of this guy was, when he saw his hand clunk down on the counter, and with a handcuffed on him, handcuffed to an RCMP officer. And he looked at his dress. He was disheveled, he had long hair, he was a smoker, he kind of, he was wearing a jean jacket and stuff. And to me, I don't blame Eric. He was nervous, he was a young pilot, there was all these things on his mind. But to me, it just showed me how we can sometimes assume people are a certain way. We assume because a guy has handcuffs, that's the first impression, right? He's in handcuffs, he looks a bit scruffy. If there's a gun around, wow, I'm in trouble. And, because he was swearing after the plane crash, and he was so angry, it's perception. The pilot just thought, oh my gosh, he's angry at me, and he's going to kill me. But from Paul's perspective, Paul was just letting off steam, because, I can't believe it. here I am flying into, and I'm in this stupid plane crash. And he was, and he wanted the gun, but he wanted it to shoot it off because maybe, it would bring the planes, it would bring the rescue planes. So it's a matter of how you perceive people. And we all make judgments about others based on who we think they are or how they look or their past history. But that may not give us the whole picture of who they are.
Paul was indeed an unlikely hero, but he was a tragic hero as well, wasn't he?
He was. That's exactly right. He was an unlikely hero. He was the last person you would have expected to be heroic, and yet he was. And what was really interesting to me is he reminded me that all of us maybe have something heroic inside of us, and maybe we don't know it or other people don't know it, and it just takes a certain event to bring that out in us. And yes, he was tragic as well, because I think he was heroic. He was heroic in his soul. He was heroic as a person, but the fact that he couldn't overcome, the hand that life had dealt him. He'd had a bad start, he'd had a broken family, he hadn't been able to finish high school. All of those things played into his eventual kind of demise. And I think that was tragic, because I think had he had a different start in life, or had he had one more person, like you guys have Mr. Nex, who believes in you and who brings out the best in you, then I think his life might have been completely different.
What do you think would have happened if it had been Larry or Scott who was uninjured and had saved everybody? What do you think, given their backgrounds?
My dad, he was tough. He was tough. He was a tough guy. Tough, mentally tough, not physically strong, but mentally, he was a guy who didn't give up. I think he would have risen, and he did. I mean, he couldn't see. He lost his glasses, he was blind, but yet he trudged through thigh-deep snow and all sorts of deadfall and stuff, and didn't give up either. So I think sometimes what people seem to be on the outside, you don't really know how they're going to react when things are really bad. Some people will surprise you.
Very true. But the fact is that Paul is a stark revelation about the human condition, that perhaps there is a capacity in all of us to do the right thing and help each other in a crisis.
I think that's a really insightful comment. And I think that's one of the themes of the book. Really, the underlying theme is sometimes we don't know what we're made of. We don't know who the heroes are among us. And the whole title of the book, Into the Abyss, comes from a quote that says it's only by going down to the lowest point or coming up against something that really pushes you that you really discover the treasures of life or what you're made of. And you're right, it was who Paul was, in fact, who all of these men were, really showed me anyway, that we all have capacities, hidden capacities, and they may kind of just lie hidden for a long time until something really forces us to reach down and dig out the best in all of us. And you're exactly right. It really was. Paul, of all of them, really was an example of, the heroes among us and what we're all capable of if we have to really dig deep.
Well, I woke up to the sound of silence. The cars were cutting like knives in a fist fight. And I found you with a bottle of wine, your head in the curtains and heart like the 4th of July. You swore and said we are not shining stars. This I know, I never said we are. Though I never been through hell like that, I've closed enough windows to know you can never look back. If you're lost and alone, or you're sinking like a stone, carry on. May your past be the sound of your feet upon the ground. Carry on. Carry on, carry on.